Good afternoon, Forest Hill Falcons staff and students. I hope you're all doing well. And I'm glad to be here today, looking to pick up where I left off in Louis Sachar's holes. Last we left off with Stanley. He had just given X-Ray his tube or cylinder that he had found. And so he wasn't too happy that he had to give it to X-Ray, but he figured might as well. Better chances of him surviving there if he had friends instead of one singular day off. So we're gonna pick up chapter 16 and read a couple chapters and see how we make out. All right. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. "See what I'm saying?" X-Ray said. "Am I right or am I right?" The other bodies in the room were a little more than a bag of flesh and bones dumped across broken chairs and couches. X-Ray, though, man, he was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. "Yo, caveman! My man!" he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. "Hey, slide over, Squid," said X-Ray. "Make room for the caveman." Stanley crashed on the couch. He had looked for a hidden camera in the shower, and he hadn't seen anything. And he hoped the warden hadn't either. "What's the matter?" asked X-Ray. "You guys tired or something?" "Hey, keep it down, will you?" groaned Zigzag. "I'm trying to watch TV." Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes and 3 tended to the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging, because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was very careful not to dump any of the dirt into the hole where he actually found the gold tube. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He thought that it might have been the lid to a fancy gold pen. KB could have been the initials of the famous author, perhaps. The only famous authors he could think of at the time were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, Mark Twain. Besides, it really didn't look like the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so they can get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down in that hole and dig with them." After that, everybody worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran when he pushed his wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they weren't Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until after every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley sat sprawled across an understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way he could tell the warden where the tube was actually found without getting himself or X-Ray into trouble. But it didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging in that hole by himself. But the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig at night. Besides, the shovels were locked up at night, presumably so they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Pendansky entered the rec room. "Stanley," he called as he made his way into the room. "His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Pendansky again. "My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter here for someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Pendansky. He turned over an envelope in his hands. "Doesn't say Caveman anywhere on this." It was from his mother. "Oh, thanks," said Stanley after he took it. "Who's it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put it in a big pocket of his pants. "Aren't you going to read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want to read it to us, he doesn't have to read it to us. It's probably from his girlfriend anyways." Stanley smiled. He read it later, after the other boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of the moms who can afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I am very proud of you for trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows? Maybe something good will come out of this." Your father thinks he's really close to a breakthrough on his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord is threatening to evict us because of the odor. I feel sorry for that little old lady who lived in a shoe. It must have smelled something awful. Love from both of us. Hey, what's so funny? Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. Nothing. Just something my mom wrote. Well, what'd she say? Asked Zero. Nothing. Oh. Sorry, said Zero. Well, see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. So the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking these old sneakers. So anyways, in the letter, my mom said she felt sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe. You know, because it must have smelled bad in there. Zero stared at him blankly. You know, the nursery rhyme. Zero said nothing. You've heard the nursery rhyme about that little old lady in the shoe, right? No. Stanley was amazed. How'd it go? Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street growing up? Stanley asked. Zero just stared at him blankly. Stanley headed back to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. Chapter 17. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around where X-Ray had supposedly found that gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole, as well as other holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the fourth day, when all three holes met and formed one big, gigantic hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less impatient. Less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later into the day. This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday, she said after arriving late one morning. Well, what have you guys been doing here? Nothing, said Squid. It was the wrong thing to say. At just that moment, Armpit was returning from a bathroom break. How nice of you to join us, she said. And what have you been doing? I had to, I had to go. The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt, and 3 tiny spots of blood formed. You're giving these boys too much water, the warden told Mr. Pendansky. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the other groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in the big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using the wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it to the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up to see Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. I ain't digging that dirt up, Zigzag said. That's your dirt. Hey, Mom, Magnet called. Caveman's been hurt. Stanley brought his fingers up to the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet and then up out of the hole. Mr. Sir had made a bandage out of a piece of his sack and sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It is nap time, he said. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. That's your dirt, Zigzag said. You have to dig it up. It's covering up my dirt. Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt in which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, then Zigzag dug a shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys out to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least he knew just how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have any other shovels swinging past his face, or the warden hanging around either. He dug a shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile. He had made his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where a zigzag shovel had hit him. The part of his head between his neck and his ear was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors at camp, but he imagined what he looked like. He probably looked like a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat in his hole. After a shower, he put his dirty clothes in his crate and got out his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write the letter so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him for writing to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard, but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses, and I have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn... He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was nobody. To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry. Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned, and he felt his neck throb. I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys... I don't know, said Zero. You don't know what? I don't know how. What? What do you mean? Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you what? Rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn how to read and write, said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he had thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to try to teach Zero how to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. You don't have to teach me to write, said Zero. Just to read. I don't have anyone to write to anyways. Sorry, Stanley said again. His muscles and hands were the only part of his body that hadn't... His muscles and hands weren't the only parts of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished writing his letter. He barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal the stamp of the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty at Camp Green Lake. All right, so tomorrow, guys, I'll read chapter 19 and on. I hope you enjoyed those couple chapters there, and I hope you're enjoying the book. It's one of my favorites, like I mentioned before. Right now, being almost halfway through the book, I'm also kind of thinking of what to read next. So I'll try to figure that out for you guys as well. I really hope you guys are doing really well, and I really can't wait to see you again. And be safe and be kind to one another. See ya.